He's not responding again, Mr. Whitmore. The call came at 2:17 p.m., cutting through Marcus Whitmore's board meeting like a crack in glass. And by 2:43, he was pulling into the circular driveway of his 9,000-square-foot estate, jaw tight, tie loosened, the afternoon sun glaring off the windows like accusation. He wasn't supposed to be home this early, not on a Tuesday, not in the middle of a $200 million acquisition. But the word again echoed louder than profit margins because again meant his 8-year-old son Noah had shut down. Again meant another specialist had failed. Again meant the silence in that house was growing heavier than the marble floors beneath it. Marcus stepped through the front doors expecting tension, maybe raised voices, maybe the strained calm of staff trying too hard. But instead he was met with something that didn't fit his world at all. Quiet. Not the hollow quiet he'd grown used to, but a steady, breathing kind of quiet drifting from the study down the east wing. He moved toward it, Italian. Leather shoes muted against the hardwood, and stopped at the doorway. On the rug, beneath the tall windows where late September light spilled in warm and gold, sat Alina Carter, the maid he barely noticed most mornings, her uniform simple, sleeves rolled to her forearms, posture relaxed but attentive. In front of her, cross-legged and still, sat Noah. No overturned chair, no frantic pacing, no hands clamped over ears. Just stillness. A sheet of construction paper lay between them, crayons, scattered like quiet confetti. And Alina wasn't speaking in lectures or instructions. She was tracing slow shapes with a blue crayon, steady arcs, then sliding it gently toward Noah, without pressure. Marcus felt irritation rise before understanding did. Boundaries mattered in his house. Roles mattered, structure mattered. And no one had authorized the maid to step into territory that tutors with framed degrees had struggled to enter. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice low but edged with control, the kind of tone that usually reset a room instantly. Alina looked up, not startled, not defensive, just present. "He needed a minute," she said softly, as if explaining something obvious. Marcus glanced at his son, expecting withdrawal at the sound of his voice, the familiar flinch. But Noah didn't retreat. Instead, the boy's small fingers hovered over the blue crayon, then slowly closed around it. Marcus watched, as his son drew a single uneven line beside Alina's arc. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was the first voluntary movement Marcus had seen in weeks that wasn't guided by a therapist's script. The air in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Sunlight warmed the floorboards, dust motes drifting lazily through beams of light. And for a moment Marcus realized something unsettling. This quiet connection unfolding on the rug didn't respond to authority, to money, or to perfectly scheduled appointments. It responded to patience. And standing there in a $2,000 suit, Marcus felt, for the first time in months, like he was the one outside the door looking in. Marcus did not step fully into the room right away because stepping in meant interrupting something he did not understand. And for a man who built his empire on understanding every variable, that unsettled him more than any market risk ever had. He cleared his throat instead, a quiet signal of authority, expecting Noah to stiffen, but the boy only glanced up briefly before returning his focus to the paper, the blue crayon moving again in a slow, deliberate line that curved toward Alina's drawing. As if the two shapes were learning how to meet. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and warm wood, and outside the 12-foot windows the late afternoon breeze shifted the oak branches, shadows swaying gently across the floor. Marcus folded his arms, watching. "The tutor said he refused to participate," he said, his voice measured. Alina nodded slightly without breaking the calm rhythm she had established. "He did not refuse," she replied softly. "He just needed space before he could begin." Marcus almost corrected her because in his world delays meant inefficiency, and inefficiency meant failure. But the word begin lingered in his mind. Noah's shoulders were no longer tight against his ears, and his breathing, once shallow and erratic in moments like these, now rose and fell in a steadier cadence. Alina shifted the paper an inch closer to him, not directing, only inviting. "You are not paid to teach," Marcus said, though the edge in his tone was thinner now. "No, sir," she answered, meeting his eyes briefly. "But I am here," and he looked like he did not want to be alone. The simplicity of that statement settled heavily in the room. Marcus had hired specialists with credentials from top universities, professionals who charged more per hour than some families earned in a week, and yet none of them had described his son's struggle in terms of loneliness. They had used phrases like behavioral regression and adaptive response, clinical terms that felt safe because they were distant. Noah paused, staring at the crayon in his hand, as if deciding whether the next line was worth the effort. Then, slowly, he placed the tip back on the page and drew a second curve that connected to Alina's. The two lines formed something imperfect but whole. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, not panic, not anger, but recognition. He realized he could not remember the last time he had sat on the floor beside his son without an agenda. His presence had become another appointment on the calendar, squeezed between conference calls and investor briefings. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second unusually loud in the stillness. And for once Marcus did not reach for his phone to check the time. He watched as Noah shifted closer to Alina by barely an inch, a movement so small it would have gone unnoticed in any other context. Yet here it felt monumental. Marcus lowered his arms slowly, the posture of command easing without his permission, and in that quiet sunlit room, he began to sense that control had never been the answer, that perhaps what his son needed was not another expert voice, but someone willing to sit in the silence without trying to conquer it. The room remained suspended in that fragile calm, the kind that could disappear with a single wrong word, and Marcus felt the unfamiliar weight of not knowing what to say. He took a slow step inside, the door easing shut behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. Noah's eyes flickered up at the sound, not startled, just aware, and for a brief second Marcus saw something he had not seen in months. Curiosity. Alina shifted slightly, giving father and son a clear line of sight to each other without forcing the moment. The late afternoon sun had lowered, casting longer shadows across the Persian rug, turning the edges of the room amber. Marcus loosened his shoulders, then, almost awkwardly, removed his suit jacket and draped it over the back of a nearby chair. The movement felt symbolic, though he would not have admitted that aloud. "Noah," he said gently, careful not to let command creep back into his voice. The boy's fingers tightened around the crayon, and for a heartbeat Marcus feared the connection would break. Instead, Noah glanced at the paper, then at his father, and slowly tapped the space beside the drawing with the blue crayon. It was not a word, not a full invitation, but it was direction. Alina noticed and subtly shifted back another inch, creating room without drawing attention to herself. Marcus hesitated only a second before lowering himself to the floor, the hardwood firm beneath him, the crease in his pressed trousers folding in a way he would normally correct. He did not correct it. He sat cross-legged, uncertain but present. The ticking clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, yet it no longer felt accusatory. It felt like a witness. Noah moved the crayon toward his father, then withdrew it halfway, as if testing whether this was safe. Marcus extended his hand slowly, palm open. The crayon rested there. It was a simple object, wax and paper, yet it felt heavier than any contract he had signed. He drew a small, uneven line beside the two connected curves, unsure whether he was doing it correctly. There was no right way, no performance metric, no quarterly report. There was only the paper between them. Noah leaned closer, examining the addition, then adjusted his own line slightly so that all three shapes touched. Marcus exhaled, a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Alina watched quietly, hands folded loosely in her lap, her presence steady but unobtrusive. The mansion, with its vaulted ceilings and imported stone, suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a home that had been waiting for this exact silence to soften. Outside, a car passed on the distant road, the faint hum barely audible, and Marcus realized how rarely he had allowed himself to simply sit without solving something. For the first time since his wife's passing, he was not trying to fix Noah. He was learning how to join him. And in that quiet triangle formed by three imperfect blue lines, Marcus sensed a truth unfolding gently but undeniably. That strength was not in control, but in the courage to stay. The paper lay between them, three uneven blue lines touching like something fragile but real, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was alive. Marcus felt the firmness of the floor beneath him, the faint pressure in his knees, the steady warmth of the late afternoon sun stretching across the rug, and for the first time in months he did not feel the need to check his watch. Noah shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against his father's sleeve. Not by accident, but not fully deliberate either, just enough to test the space. Marcus remained still, resisting the instinct to fill the moment with instruction. Alina arose quietly to her feet, not in retreat, but in trust, giving them room without ceremony. "I will be in the kitchen if you need anything," she said gently, her voice calm, and she stepped out of the study with soft, measured steps, leaving behind the faint scent of clean linen and something steadier than that. The door remained open. Marcus looked down at the drawing again. 3 lines, imperfect, connected. He had closed billion-dollar negotiations with less tension than this. He turned slightly toward Noah. "I have been trying to make you better," he said slowly, choosing each word as if it mattered more than any speech he had ever given. "But maybe I have not been very good at sitting with you instead." Noah's fingers hovered over the page, then traced the point where the lines met. His breathing stayed even. Outside, the light shifted further, casting long golden rectangles across the floor, and the house felt less like a monument to achievement and more like a place waiting to be lived in. Marcus thought of the months since his wife passed, the doctors, the schedules, the strategies, the belief that structure would protect them from grief. He realized he had been managing sorrow the way he managed markets, with force and precision, and neither had worked here. Noah leaned closer again, then slowly rested his head against his father's arm. It was a small weight, barely noticeable, yet it pressed into Marcus with unexpected gravity. He did not move. He did not reach for solutions. He simply let the moment exist. Down the hall, faint kitchen sounds echoed softly. The gentle clink of porcelain, the low hum of the refrigerator, ordinary life continuing. Marcus understood something quietly profound then. Something that no consultant or therapist had articulated. Healing in this house would not come from control, it would come from presence. And as Noah's hand lightly gripped the fabric of his sleeve, Marcus allowed himself to stay exactly where he was, not as a billionaire, not as a problem solver, but as a father learning, for the first time, how to be still. The light outside had softened into early evening gold by the time Noah finally shifted his weight and sat upright again. His hand still loosely wrapped around the fabric of his father's sleeve, as if testing whether the connection would remain once he moved. Marcus stayed seated on the floor, legs stiff now, but unwilling to break the quiet spell by standing too quickly. The drawing between them had grown slightly. A few more careful lines added in different shades of blue, forming something abstract yet shared. The house, once echoing with tension, carried only the low hum of the heating system and the distant clink of dishes being set down in the kitchen. Marcus studied his son's face, noticing details he had overlooked before, the faint crease between his brows when concentrating, the way his breathing slowed when no one pressed him for words. "I have been asking you to fight your silence," Marcus said gently, his voice lower than usual, less polished, more honest. "But maybe I needed to sit inside it with you." Noah's eyes lifted, meeting his father's for a full second, longer than they had in weeks. It was not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady. Then Noah did something small yet impossible to ignore. He leaned forward and placed the blue crayon carefully into Marcus's open palm again, not as a test this time, but as an offering. Marcus swallowed the tightness in his throat and drew another line, slower now, letting his hand follow instinct rather than precision. The shape connected imperfectly, yet Noah nodded once, a nearly invisible gesture of approval. In the hallway, soft footsteps approached and paused. Alina stood at the doorway, not intruding, simply observing. Her expression was calm, but her eyes reflected quiet understanding. Marcus looked up at her, and for the first time there was no hierarchy in his gaze, only recognition. "Thank you," he said. The words simple but unguarded. Alina gave a small nod. "He did the hard part," she replied. Softly, Marcus glanced back at Noah and realized she was right. Connection could not be forced, only received. Noah shifted again, then slowly, deliberately, rested his head against his father's shoulder. It was not a collapse of exhaustion or retreat. It was trust. Marcus let his arms settle around his son's back, not gripping, just supporting. Outside, The sky deepened into amber and rose, the last light stretching across the lawn. And for the first time since grief had settled into the walls of that mansion, the silence no longer felt like loss. It felt like space. And in that quiet space, father and son remained seated on the floor, not fixed, not finished, but together, learning that strength was not measured in control or achievement, but in the courage to stay when nothing else could be solved. Night settled gradually over the estate, the last trace of gold fading from the windows as soft interior lights replaced the sun, casting a warmer glow across the study. Marcus remained on the floor longer than he had intended, feeling the steady weight of Noah's head against his shoulder, the quiet rhythm of his son's breathing syncing with his own. Somewhere in the distance, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once, then twice. Marking the hour without urgency, Noah lifted his head, slowly, not pulling away but adjusting, and looked at the drawing again as if memorizing it. Marcus followed his gaze and realized that what lay on the paper was more than crayon lines. It was proof that connection had happened without pressure. He turned slightly toward the doorway where Alina still stood, not intruding, simply present in case she was needed. "Would you join us for dinner?" Marcus asked, the question sincere, free of obligation. Alina hesitated only a moment, then nodded softly. "If that is all right," she replied. It was a small shift in routine, yet it felt significant. They moved to the dining room together, not in a formal procession but quietly, naturally. The long oak table that once felt too large for two now felt less intimidating. Marcus pulled out a chair for Noah, then one for Alina, an instinctive gesture that surprised even him. The staff remained discreetly out of sight, the house unusually calm. Plates were set, simple food placed gently at the center, nothing extravagant, just warm bread, roasted vegetables, and soup that carried a comforting aroma. Noah sat between them, not rigid, not withdrawn. Marcus watched as his son reached for the bread without hesitation. It was a small act, yet Marcus noticed every detail, the steady hand, the unhurried motion. Conversation remained minimal, but it was no longer strained. The silence held ease instead of absence. At one point, Noah glanced toward Alina and then back to his father, as if measuring the space between them. And Marcus offered a faint smile, not forced, not practiced, simply there. After dinner, Noah stood and quietly picked up the drawing from the study, carrying it with careful hands. He paused at the bottom of the staircase, then looked back at his father. Marcus understood the unspoken request. He followed, step by step, up the wide wooden stairs that had once echoed with emptiness. At Noah's bedroom door, the boy turned and, with gentle deliberation, pressed the drawing into his father's hand. Marcus held it as though it were something fragile and irreplaceable. Noah then stepped inside his room without hesitation. Marcus remained at the doorway, watching as his son settled beneath the soft gray blanket, the bedside lamp casting a warm circle of light. The house was quiet again, but this quiet felt different, less like isolation and more like rest. Marcus lowered himself into the chair beside the bed and, for the first time in months, did not feel the need to plan tomorrow. He simply stayed, listening to the steady breath of his child, understanding that tonight, that was enough. The bedside lamp cast a soft amber circle across the wall as Marcus sat in the upholstered chair beside Noah's bed, the drawing resting loosely in his hands. The house had settled into nighttime stillness, the kind that once echoed too loudly through empty hallways. But tonight it felt steadier, almost protective. Noah shifted beneath the gray blanket, turning slightly toward his father instead of away. Marcus noticed the change immediately. He had grown used to watching his son's back as a quiet wall, a small barrier that grief had built between them. Now that wall seemed thinner. "I am here," Marcus said quietly, not as a promise meant to fix anything, but as a simple statement of presence. Noah's eyes remained open for a moment longer, studying his father's face as if searching for something. Then, in a movement so subtle it could have been missed, he nodded once. Marcus felt the weight of that gesture more than any spoken sentence. Downstairs, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the hallway clock continued their steady rhythm. Ordinary sounds, grounding. Marcus placed the drawing gently on the nightstand, smoothing its edges as though it were a fragile document. 3 imperfect blue lines, connected. He realized that what had shifted today was not Noah's condition, but his own understanding. He had been trying to pull his son out of silence, unaware that the only way through it was to enter it beside him. After several quiet minutes, Noah's breathing deepened, slower now, more even. Marcus waited, counting each rise and fall of his son's chest, resisting the impulse to check his phone or step away. When he was certain sleep had come naturally, without tension, he rose carefully and adjusted the blanket at Noah's shoulder. The simple act felt ceremonial. At the doorway, Marcus paused, looking back at the small figure resting peacefully beneath the warm light. For months, that room had felt like a place he visited cautiously, unsure how to repair what grief had unsettled. Tonight it felt different, not solved, not perfect, but softer. He stepped into the hallway and found Alina standing a few feet away, as if she had been listening not for conversation but for quiet. He fell asleep, Marcus said, his voice low but steady. Alina nodded, relief passing gently across her face. There was no pride in her expression, no expectation of praise, only calm. Marcus met her eyes with something he had not offered before, genuine respect. You did not try to fix him, he said thoughtfully. You stayed. Alina gave a small, knowing smile. Sometimes that is enough, she replied. Marcus glanced once more toward the closed bedroom door, understanding that tonight had not been about expertise or authority. It had been about patience, about courage measured in minutes rather than victories. As they walked quietly down the hall, the house no longer felt like a monument to achievement, but like a place learning to breathe again. And for the first time since loss had settled into its walls, Marcus felt something shift within himself, a quiet recognition that strength was not the power to command, but the humility to remain. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as the hour grew later, casting a softer glow. Along the walls lined with framed photographs of milestones and achievements. Yet Marcus noticed how few of them captured quiet moments. He walked slowly toward his study, the door still open from earlier, the faint scent of paper and polished wood lingering in the air. The drawing Noah had carried upstairs rested now on the nightstand, but its image remained clear in his mind. 3 blue lines touching, without symmetry, yet without separation. Marcus paused at his desk, the leather chair behind it waiting like an old habit, and for the first time in years he did not sit. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out over the manicured lawn stretching nearly 2 acres into the night. The estate lights illuminated the hedges with careful precision, everything trimmed, everything controlled, yet inside the house something had shifted beyond design. Footsteps approached softly, and Alina appeared at the edge of the doorway, ready to retreat if unneeded. Marcus turned toward her, his posture no longer rigid but reflective. I built this house to protect my family, he said quietly, the words unfiltered. I thought if everything was stable, structured, secure, nothing could fall apart. Alina listened without interruption, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Grief does not respond to structure, she replied gently. It responds to safety. The simplicity of her words lingered longer than any executive briefing ever had. Marcus exhaled slowly, recognizing that he had mistaken control for safety, achievement for stability. Would you consider something? He asked after a pause. Not as an employee following instruction, but as someone Noah trusts. Alina met his gaze steadily. If it helps him, I will consider it. Marcus nodded, then continued. I would like you to spend more time with him, not because I cannot afford specialists, but because I finally understand that connection cannot be outsourced. The admission felt both humbling and freeing. Alina did not respond immediately. She measured the weight of the request before answering. I will stay as long as he needs consistency, she said softly. Marcus felt a quiet gratitude rise within him, not dramatic, not loud, but real. The house around them seemed to breathe easier, as if the walls themselves sensed the shift. Downstairs, a distant door clicked closed as the staff finished for the evening. The estate settled fully into rest. Marcus glanced once more toward the staircase leading to Noah's room. He understood now that healing would not arrive overnight. There would be difficult mornings and uncertain days. But tonight had proven something essential. That presence was stronger than pressure. as he turned off the study lamp and walked toward the staircase. Marcus carried no contracts, no devices, only the steady intention to remain, and in that quiet resolve, the mansion felt less like a monument to power and more like a place where hearts, even wounded ones, could begin to feel safe again. Morning arrived gently over the estate, pale lights stretching across the lawn and filtering through tall windows as if the house itself was waking more slowly than usual. Marcus stood in the kitchen before the rest of the staff had begun their routines, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, a simple breakfast laid out with careful intention rather than efficiency. The events of the previous evening lingered not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet shift that had settled into the rhythm of the house. Footsteps padded softly across the hardwood, and Noah appeared at the doorway, hair slightly tousled, eyes clearer than they had been in months. Marcus did not rush toward him or fill the space with questions. He simply looked up and offered a calm, steady smile. Noah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then walked forward without retreating, taking a seat at the kitchen island. The morning sun traced a warm line across the counter, illuminating the simple drawing Marcus had placed there beside the plates. 3 blue lines, connected. Noah noticed it immediately. His small fingers touched the paper lightly. Then he looked up at his father. The silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt shared. A moment later, Alina entered quietly, greeting them with the same gentle composure she carried the day before. Noah glanced between them, then reached for the crayon Marcus had set beside the drawing, adding one more careful line that curved outward, expanding the shape rather than closing it. Marcus watched without speaking, understanding the unspoken meaning. Connection was not a single event. It was something that could grow. The house felt different now, not because its structure had changed, but because its atmosphere had softened. The high ceilings and polished floors no longer echoed with distance. They carried the quiet sound of movement and breath. As breakfast continued, Noah looked up once more, meeting his father's eyes with a steadiness that felt intentional. "Stay," he said softly, the word clear and unforced. Marcus did not react with surprise this time. He nodded, his voice calm and certain. "I am not going anywhere." Outside, the sun rose higher over the 2-acre property, lights spilling across trimmed hedges and open sky. Inside, no speeches were made, no grand declarations followed. There was only a father who chose presence over control, a child who felt safe enough to speak, and a woman who had understood that healing begins not with instruction but with patience. And in the stillness of that brightening morning, the mansion stood quietly transformed, not by power, but by the simple courage to remain.